Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I have with me an amazing guest today. We've been discussing Tulsi Gabbard's record. And, this channel has not necessarily been antagonistic towards it, even though I haven't necessarily given endorsement. This channel supports Sanders. But that said, I wanted to have an honest dialogue about Tulsi that didn't necessarily involve the smears from the Democratic establishment that just hates her guts. Just an honest conversation from the standpoint of the left in regards to some of the things you support. From my own thing, I left out the India aspect of this. I dealt with the torture and dealt with the LGBT community issue because, those are more homegrown. But this one specifically for India, it is outside of my context. And because it's outside of my context, it's hard for me to understand everything that takes place within the context of another country, particularly the political affairs of another country that seems to be somewhat drastically different, even though you can say the fights that they have over, the movements and so forth are within their own context. Everyone has their own struggles. But how that looks politically is different in India. I've watched some of Tulsi Gabbard's content in ever so where she's giving like a lecture or she's talking about something, and it seems so bizarre to me. But understand the bizarreness is purely contextual. So I didn't necessarily feel up to snuff to have a conversation about it because I didn't know. One of my subscribers sent me a video by, I can't think of the gentleman's name, but it's with this guest that I have, Pieter Friedrich. And the video essentially goes into Tulsi's record. She said, hey, could you talk about this? Instead of just talking about it, I thought, Grandma Elwick, that was the person. Instead of talking about it, I just thought, just bring the guy on the show, see if the guy will come on the show. So Pieter Friedrich was nice enough to come on the show. He is a author and columnist. He is 12 years analyst of South Asian affairs, working with subterranean Indian minority community activists, essentially, non-hegemonic groups within the context of Indian continent. Pieter Friedrich, welcome to the show, and thank you very much for coming on for short notice.
Hi, Jamal. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
And we talked about this a few times, but just so I'm making sure I got that right, correct? To every analyst of South Asian affairs, working with subterranean Indian minorities. Subaltern. Okay, subaltern. Yeah. And I would imagine that people here are probably not going to know what that means. So can you explain what that means?
Basically, I have primarily worked with Indian minority groups, with Buddhists, Christians, Sikhs, Dalits, Muslims, as well as with some progressive Hindus. But subaltern is basically, it's an academic term that means non-hegemonic groups which do not have power.
Okay, fair enough. Essentially minorities within the country, minorities that don't have political influence. Essentially, they're at the behest of whatever the viewpoint is or whatever the majority opinion is in that country.
Exactly.
Okay. So Tulsi is running for president of the United States. And this is, this all of a sudden, all of the demons that were in the closet come out to play because other political factions within the country, some are against her, some are being more fair to her in regards to her, but all of the stuff comes out to play from the standpoint of the presidency because at this point it's going to be a highly contested presidency, and there's going to be like 30 people on the Democratic side. The Indian thing to me was very interesting. So part of this has to do with her association with Modi, and this is where people have been hitting her on. Now, could you explain the issue with Modi? There was a riot, or there was a burning of a train car. The burning of a train car killed several people who were inside, but many of which were Hindus. This prompted Modi, who was at the time, the governor of that particular, we would probably consider him a governor of that particular area. Now, what did Modi do, and why is Modi getting culpability for what took place after the burning of that train car?
So there was a train that got fire. It allegedly was set fire by Muslims, although that has never been entirely proven. And it's kind of actually irrelevant to what ended up happening. 59 people died in this train. Immediately after they died, Modi ordered their bodies paraded. He ordered a strike throughout the entire state. And then within hours, he accused the Pakistan Secret Service of being behind the attacks. And then members of his political party, the BJP, as well as members of the RSS, a paramilitary group which is basically in control of the BJP, and other Hindu nationalist organizations, took to the streets en masse throughout the entire state in cities far away from where the attack happened. And over a period of about 3 days, massacred approximately 2,000 or more Muslims. Mostly Muslims died in this attack. The official figures are about 1,000 people, but independent investigations by human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch put the numbers at 2,000 plus people that died. These were men, women, children. They were burned alive. Women and girls were dragged out of their homes. They were gang raped. People were hacked to death. A member, I believe he was a member of parliament at the time, or a former member of parliament, Joffrey, was murdered in his home. And the mobs over the period of several days were, according to witnesses documented by Human Rights Watch, were chanting things like, "The police are with us, long live Narendra Modi." And they, according to Amnesty International, according to Human Rights Watch, according to the US State Department, the BJP, the RSS, the VHP, which is another internationalist organization, were the primary instigators behind this. There are people that were involved in it, participants, perpetrators, including legislators from Modi's party, the BJP, who were later caught on camera saying that Modi gave us sanction for this. He gave us 3 days. He told us, take 3 days, do whatever you want as retaliation. And then after 3 days, you got to stop. But witnesses also say, victims also say the police were complicit, were firing on them.
Now, from the standpoint of international community, the international community looked at Modi as being culpable for this, right? I mean, the United States wouldn't even allow him into the country.
From 2005 to 2014, he was banned from entering the U.S. Yeah, and widely he was looked at by the international community, not just the U.S., but other countries and basically every major international human rights organization as complicit, as a silent sanction at the very least.
Has there been any investigation in the country itself, and meaning has the court systems in India itself looked at this and found any level of culpability with the standpoint of Modi? Meaning, clearly he's president of India, like he's in charge. So clearly,
India has a president as well.
I'm sorry, prime minister. I know, like sometimes there's a difference, like prime minister and presidents in countries, but clearly he's the person in charge of India. He's the prime minister.
Yes.
Has there been any independent investigation in India itself, or any, you can say, bureaucratic, like legal investigation into the continent, into the incident itself, that showed culpability of Modi?
In order to answer that, one thing I want to raise is there have been other incidents of mass violence, pogroms, genocides. In 1984, there was a genocide against Sikhs in the capital, Delhi. 3,000 plus Sikhs died. It was conducted under the auspices of the government at the time, of the ruling party at the time. And that was 84. 2018, 34 years later, an MP, a member of parliament, the equivalent of a congressperson, of a representative, was convicted and sentenced to, I believe, life in prison for leading mobs in that genocide. 34 years later. So the way the justice system works in India is that in these kinds of incidents of mass violence, even where the government is complicit, just because it's 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, doesn't mean justice has been dealt.
So essentially, they can always come back and try to prosecute if a different government is in place and they want to look back over those, let's be honest, crimes. I mean, you can say genocide is strong for me because genocide to me is somewhat of a technical thing. But clearly,
is also, I think, would be a acceptable word. But I don't really like to quibble over the terms. I'm more like to,
I mean, it's a large number of people being killed. It's bad either way you want to cut it.
Was the government behind it or not? Was it state sponsored or not? And if it's state sponsored, that to me, that's one of the things that's most serious. In the case of Modi, it's commonly said that he got a clean chit, so-called, from the court system. Yeah. The reality is he was never tried. There was a special investigation team that was formed. And ultimately, they came back and they said, there is not enough evidence to prosecute him. but they did not exonerate him. They did not clear him of the charges. And he, in later years, when he was addressing occasionally the issue, he compared the pain that he feels for the victims, the Muslim victims, to the pain that a passenger in a car would feel if a puppy was run over.
I was reading that. Like I said, the Modi thing is a little disturbing to me, if I'm being completely honest. So the BJP. So who is the BJP? I'm giving a primer on this stuff because I need to put it within the context that people can understand it, like, you know, what this stuff is. Because I don't pay attention to Indian politics per se, like talking about. I don't know how many people who are on my channel indulge themselves in Indian politics. So this is somewhat of a primer on this stuff. Who is the BJP? What is the BJP?
The BJP is a relatively new party in India. It was formed in 1980. It is basically the political wing of a group called the RSS, which was formed in the 1920s. The RSS is a paramilitary organization. It's been declared by the US government as a nationalist organization, a political pressure group, nationalist organization. It is all male, although they do have
Wait, it's all male? The group is all male?
It's all male.
Okay.
It's uniformed. They wear traditionally they've worn khaki shorts, white shirt, a black cap, and they have a salute like that.
Yeah.
They meet weekly or daily for they are called shakas, basically a meeting where they train, they drill with bamboo staffs. Mm-hmm. They engage in indoctrination training, and so on and so forth. They've been in continuous existence since the 1920s. And every single one of their chiefs, including their longest serving chief, their second and longest serving chief, who was in charge of the organization for about 35, 40 years, every single one of them has proclaimed that their goal is to establish India as a Hindu nation.
Kind of like Israel, essentially a Jewish nation. In this case, they want to be a Hindu nation.
You want to analogize it to it that way?
So going further, how does this relate to Tulsi Gabbard? Because the association is being created between Tulsi Gabbard and Modi. What is the association? What is the link between what's, you know, for all intents and purposes, you can say it's not a war criminal because he wasn't in the context of war, but clearly it looks like a violent criminal act and from somewhat of a mass slaughter. So, you know, there are no words harsh enough to describe, you know, what took place.
And basically,
there probably are, because there are worse things that took place, but it's horrendous. Like it's bad. What is Tulsi Gabbard's association with Modi in this case?
Well, the real association is not so much about Tulsi Gabbard meeting with Modi. There's things that could be said about that and things that should be said about that. But the real, much more troubling, much more disturbing issue is the way that she has been heavily mass financed by Modi's US-based supporters who are affiliated with him and his political party and the RSS, and the way that they were financing her before Modi was elected.
Is it possible to finance her because she's Hindu? I mean, like, is it just, for example, you can say that the support among African Americans supporting Obama scaled to like 95, 98%, some insane amount that dropped down when Hillary Clinton or another Democrat in. It scaled. They were going to vote for him because they're Democrat anyway, but it went up that much higher because he was African American. Can the same thing be said about this connection from the standpoint of people, essentially Hindus supporting Hindus? And if so, I guess what I'm asking is, like, is this just by virtue of who she is, not necessarily political ideology?
So I would analogize it to, in the case of Obama, like you just mentioned, the support of African American community members for Obama obviously escalated because he was an African American running for president, and one of the first successful ones that ever did so, or the first successful one that ever did so.
Yeah.
In the case of Tulsi Gabbard, her supporters are executives and active members of Hindu nationalist organizations. We're not talking about Hindus. We're not talking about people from a particular religious community. We're talking about people that belong to organizations which are directly linked to Indian organizations which have been labeled by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the US State Department, and the United Nations as ultranationalist, extremist, fundamentalist, implicated in pogroms. These organizations, the executives, the key active members of these organizations, are not supporting her because she's Hindu, but because of what she can do for them and what she has done for them in serving as an apologist for Modi and in serving the agenda of the BJP and the RSS. Hindu nationalism, as represented by the BJP and the RSS, has a multi-decade, a 30-year history of attempting to internationalize and attempting to do that for the purpose of creating political goodwill, especially with the West, in order to whitewash and conceal its actions, its crimes in India, so that it can get away with doing what it's doing in India without being questioned. And the Hindu nationalist outfits, of which there are several in the US, which are directly tied to their equivalents to their counterparts in India, those outfits in the US are the specific outfits which we are talking about having financed Gabbard.
Just so we're clear, you're making a distinction between Hindu versus Hindu nationalists. There's no underlying comparative similarity there. Like even if we're talking about the KKK, you gave the example when we were talking before about the KKK, that the KKK calls themselves a Christian organization. The baseline of that is Christian. I think that is utter nonsense. But the baseline of that is this kind of Christianity. Is it similar here? Where is there a baseline of?
It's very similar.
Okay.
The RSS is the KKK of India, and the KKK. So let's say that we had a white Christian congressional candidate, and let's say that white Christian was running for Congress, and we started digging into their financing, and we discovered David Duke gave him a donation. Okay, fine. But then let's say we discovered David Duke gave him a really big donation. Well, okay, that's interesting. Let's say then David Duke and a bunch of his friends who belong to the KKK or similar organizations also gave a lot of money. Okay, that starts to become a little more disturbing. Let's say David Duke then invites this white Christian congressional candidate to his home for a fundraiser. That starts to become even more disturbing. Let's say it happens more than once, then you see a pattern and so on and so forth. That's what I'm talking about.
Your concern is that the money that they're given is for political influence, not necessarily for any kind of religious solidarity.
Exactly.
What do you think politically? Okay, two questions. Has Tulsi Gabbard has distanced herself from the acts of these groups, or has she? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, let me ask this question a different way. The Obama administration was okay with Modi. In fact, Obama even kind of, when asked directly about Modi, he said, I think Modi is a friend of mine. And he went on to give in this kind of rah-rah, Modi is a great guy thing. The Clinton organization would have been just as close to Modi's government if Clinton got elected and Clinton got in office. I mean, the Clinton Foundation is there are documents associating this kind of relationship between the Clinton Foundation and Modi, because Clinton was kind of, in this thing of mixing government and a private organization. How is this different? Is there any kind of fundamental difference here between the way that the Democratic Party and regular, just the other Democrats who aren't Hindus or who aren't part of the Hindu party, this kind of BJP party or affiliates of the BJP party or associated with the BJP party? How is it different from them as opposed to Tulsi Gabbard?
Well, with Tulsi Gabbard, we are talking about a long-term relationship that traces back to before she even won her first election. And we are talking about common supporters of Modi and the BJP being common supporters of Gabbard and financing her. We are not talking about an executive meeting an executive on friendly terms. We're talking about a first-term congresswoman using her position to criticize and denounce any attempt to call out human rights issues in India before Modi was elected. She was using that position to prevent any attempt to address the problem of violence caused by Hindu nationalism. Mm-hmm. She was using her political power to prevent and stifle any attempt to talk about Modi and his troubling background. She was doing all of this before he was elected.
Okay, so I think your thing is they're politicians. She's a true believer.
Well, also my thing is when Obama was meeting Modi, Modi was in office. When Obama was interacting with Modi, it was as the Prime Minister of India. When Tulsi Gabbard was interacting with the supporters of Modi and the BJP and the RSS, who are executives and key members of internationalist outfits in the US who have heavily financed her. It was before Modi was in office. It was while he was desperately trying to get into office. It was while the BJP was trying to win power in India. And it was while Modi's international reputation was still tarnished and he wasn't able to use the cloak of being in office as prime minister to meet with all of these other politicians, all of these other elected officials like Obama, like any other politician, any other person, any other member of Congress that's met with him.
Last two questions. What do you believe that Gabbard is, if Gabbard gets elected, what is your fears here? I mean, like, what do you think that she's going to do? Keep in mind, I'm somewhat cynical of this. And just to explain my position here, I don't necessarily, from a political thing, I like what Tulsi Gabbard has espoused as political positions in the States. So there's that point. I need to hear more from her, meaning I want to hear her talk about this stuff. I want to hear her kind of delve into these topics in more of a full-throated way as opposed to just a news clipping here or something like that. I want to hear it. And you're right, that this connection between Modi was troubling to me, which is why I'm bringing you on the show, because I wanted to talk about it. Because if you're going to support somebody, you need to support them warts and all, to be honest about the warts. And this is a wart to some degree. I'm cynical of this. I know the political leaders that we have in this country are typically compromised. Like, so her being compromised by a different agency is essentially what we're talking about. Whether it's the Saudis, whether it's the Israeli government, those things have massive influence in our country, and those organizations find ways to donate money to the candidate of choice. So that's where I am on this. And I know that sounds like, well, if I don't want anybody influencing my political leaders, whether it's from the standpoint of Indian politics or whether it's standing from the point of the other governments. So go for it.
Yeah. So I mean, I would jump in there that we keep talking about Trump being compromised because of Russian influence and how Russia may or may not have hacked the election. That's troubling. Right. But from that perspective, I really think we should consider about how India might be interfering in US politics, and vice versa, how Tulsi Gabbard may be working with US-based Hindu nationalists to encourage their interference in Indian politics, which is directly impacting the lives of India's minorities today.
How do you think India is impeding on US politics? I mean, I got to be honest, until Tulsi Gabbard entered the race, I didn't know anything about India's interaction at all. Like you said yourself that they were trying to become internationalists, gets across this idea that they're not currently internationalists, that is somewhat local to the region. How do you think they're impinging upon US politics?
They're impinging upon US politics by buying a politician.
Well, I mean, right now, the United States government is trying to pass a BDS law, anti-BDS law, where they're trying to say it is illegal in a country that has free speech and it has codified free speech in law, that it is illegal to essentially say you don't want to buy goods from a particular country because you disagree with an occupation. That is an amazing thing that they would be willing to do that. Now, the question becomes, why are they willing to do that? Well, part of that has to do with the influence of AIPAC within our U.S. affairs. It's overt. It's clear-cut. I'm not saying it's okay. Don't misunderstand me. It just seems, some of this seems unfair. It seems like we're hitting her for stuff that we're okay with other politicians doing and getting away with. Am I wrong on that? Like, if I don't want the buying of any politician, but it seems like we don't like the buying of politicians from this country. And I don't know if the buying of the politician is strong. Let me ask that in a different way. Sure. What do you think the political consequences? Meaning, what do you think? Say you get President Tulsi, how do you think that works in the context of what are your fears on this? What do you think the negative outcome, and especially from the standpoint of what India wants in relation to U.S. politics?
Well, I would say that one of my deepest concerns, beyond the consequences and the impact on the United States, is the consequences and impact on India. And in India today, under the BJP, there is a massive influx in violence against minorities.
I saw that.
Muslims and Dalits are getting lynched. They are getting burned to death. They are getting beaten to death because they're being accused of eating beef. There are laws being passed that criminalize freedom to convert, to change your religion without.
Well, wait, just before we go, the audience may need to understand that. In India, eating meat is illegal. I mean, ultimately, you have this.
No. Eating meat is legal in India, but beef specifically is widely banned. It is not nationally banned, but it is widely banned in many states. In one state, for instance, Maharashtra, if you get caught in possession of beef, you can get sentenced to up to 5 years in prison.
But you're right. I said meat. I'm sorry. I meant beef.
Yeah.
When I was in India, there was a cow in the road and you couldn't go anywhere because there was a cow in the road. It was stuff like that where there is this kind of deification of the cow. You go to McDonald's, I think there was like a pineapple burger or something, and they find other ways to kind of make the point of beef, but they take it seriously, especially when they merge religion and politics. And so you have this kind of where, like you said, it becomes somewhat law in many of these areas, but not just law, where people take it into their own hands and actively go out and kill people because they think they're smuggling beef. Like I was reading this, I found this to be amazing. Like they pull the guy out of his car and beat the guy to death, and then they let the people off who was caught doing it. Am I wrong?
One of the most infamous incidents happened in 2015. A Muslim guy in Uttar Pradesh, a state there, he was suspected of having beef in his house. So a mob went into his house, dragged him out, killed him, beat up his son, if I recall correctly. And then thereafter, when the police went to investigate, they did end up, I think, arresting a couple of the suspects. But they also went into the guy's house and took the meat in his fridge to analyze it to see if it was actually beef.
Was it beef?
Does it matter?
It doesn't matter. I'm just curious. It's like it's bad in and of itself. It gets worse when it was empty. You know what I mean?
There was meat there, but who cares if it was beef or not?
Yeah, it's irrelevant to the thing. Well, it just feels worse when it's like even your premise was wrong. It's like not only what you did was wrong, but even your premise in doing it was wrong. It makes it that much worse when it takes place. Well, at least I think.
So I would say, to return back to your question, as far as what am I concerned about the consequences, yeah. I'm especially concerned about the consequences for India and Indians. Because in India today, academic freedom is widely stifled. Student movements are getting suppressed and being labeled as seditious. Dalit and other social activists are being harassed and arrested. Anybody that criticizes the government is being labeled as an anti-national. There is widely an atmosphere of fear and a sense of being silenced and stifled and of total suppression of freedom of expression. So
the Gabbard government will make that worse because there's no agency or there's nothing to push back on it. Essentially, it gives it somewhat of a free pass. That's
everything that she's been doing since when she was first elected, before Modi was in power, before the BJP was in power, and it only got worse after the BJP came to power. Everything that Tulsi Gabbard has been doing since 2013 has been to whitewash and crush dissent, stifle dissent, and any criticism of internationalism or of the human rights atrocities being committed by internationalists or the BJP or the RSS or Narendra Modi.
What about the argument that she's just trying to get nonpartisan cooperation with India? Meaning, if she just wants to interact with India without necessarily delving with the internal politics, we just want to leave these places alone, leave them to their devices. Yeah. But you would argue those things are simultaneously true, right? That
I would argue that if Tulsi Gabbard is of that opinion, she should actually talk to some Indian minorities living in the United States. Every single time that Modi has come to the US or to the West, but especially to the US, he's been protested. He's been heavily protested on the streets by hundreds, if not thousands of people. Now, who do you think those people are? They're not white Americans. As we just discussed, very few average Americans born in the States know about these issues. I've been to a protest in 2015 in San Jose, California. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there. There were people of all backgrounds, including many Hindus, protesting against Modi. They staged a die-in. They protested for hours and hours and hours the entire time he was there. And they are people of every religion. They are people of all backgrounds from India. If Tulsi Gabbard is so insistent on the need and the necessity to have a nonpartisan, close, friendly, intimate, collaborative relationship with India, then I think that she needs to be challenged on, one, why is that so necessary? And two, why is she so insistent that that's what every Indian American wants? Because there's thousands and thousands of Indian Americans who want something different. And what they want is for the United States to talk with India about human rights.
Fair enough. Pieter Friedrich, thank you very much. Is there anything you want to say before I close this? I try to offer the guests the last say so, because sometimes they may want to plug a book, sometimes they may want to plug something they're doing, or they may just want to say something that wasn't necessarily expressed during the interview itself.
Let's say that Tulsi Gabbard's congressional career exists because of financing and free promotion offered to her by Hindu nationalists, executives, and active members of Hindu nationalist organizations in the United States, which are the counterparts of Indian organizations. That she has simultaneously spoken at many Hindu nationalist events while taking money from these figures, and she has then provided them what they want, which is to whitewash the atrocities committed by the BJP and the RSS. And that the RSS is the KKK of India, and that shaking hands with or partnering with or befriending Modi. And I would say this about her as well as any other politician. Shaking hands with, befriending Modi is like doing that with David Duke. David Duke, Narendra Modi's the KKK. Narendra Modi's the David Duke of India.
All right, so let me, one last thing, I'm sorry. There's a few questions that the audience has, so let me go to these. By the way, are you associated with any of the political groups in India itself? Like, is there any, like, for example, that's the question. Are you associated with any political groups in India? Because if I'm talking to a Republican and it's Democrat.
Party in the US or India or anywhere else in the world.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see. And just, let's see, ask him why AIPAC is okay and Israel government crimes are cool. Essentially, kind of the question that I asked earlier, this, we're okay with buying in some cases, but not buying in the other cases. But
the Palestinian people deserve justice, and the atrocities committed against innocent Palestinians need to be called out and highlighted. And
by the way, what's the impact on the United States? I know you're saying there's certain things that Tulsi is pushing that I like, and I think there are many lefties, myself included, that likes the anti-war agenda, that likes the, you know.
I love the anti-war agenda. I would question if it's through and through anti-war, because she has a lot of talk about the need to continue this supposed war, this international endless war on terrorism, which is always targeted against Muslims, which is invariably targeted against Muslims. I question her, the sincerity of her being anti-war, but I love an anti-war candidate. I want a president who will put an end to this insane, decades-long foreign policy, which has created an American empire which has over 100 bases around the world, which has bases in over 100 countries around the world.
Yeah, things like 800 bases. But I mean, come on, let's be fair. She's been pretty staunch about not, trying to put an end to this idea of jumping from country to country and dropping these bombs. I mean, I get it that her way of getting there had more to do with, her being in Iraq and that type of stuff. But she seems earnest about it. She's been against it for the entire time she's been in Congress. Has there been any deviation in the record that gives this any notion that she's lying about this or that she's being disingenuous?
Yeah, I would say that her long-term association, beginning from before she was first elected to office, with internationalists who are connected to Indian-based organizations which are implicated in pogroms, that makes me question the word you just used. It makes me call her out as a hypocrite.
How does this is a question from the audience, Degrees in Defiance. How does the United States policy affect India policy? How does support of Modi impact the United States? Is she going to ban beef in the United States? Like, essentially, what could she possibly do? Like, I guess that's the question I asked earlier. Like, what is it that you believe that she's going to do? And I know you said you care more about this from the standpoint of India, and that's fair. But what would it do in India? What would a President Tulsi, what would the consequences be for the Indian country?
Well, if she's financed by internationalists and she's speaking at internationalist events and she's whitewashing Narendra Modi's record, what kind of president will Tulsi Gabbard be? Because we know what India is like today under the BJP, under Modi. The Senate is being stifled, people are widely being arrested, labeled as anti-national, slapped with sedition charges, so on and so forth. Nobody has the freedom to criticize the government. There is an atmosphere of fear.
Wait, you think she's a sleeper agent? Like, you think she's going to go into, you think she's going to get in the government and be distinctly different than what she has been in Congress? Because I got to be honest, I didn't know she was Hindu until this stuff started coming up. And I didn't necessarily see anything that she was saying or doing from a political ideology standpoint that to where it influenced. Meaning, what I'm looking for is, how is this impinging upon the political space? What is she doing that is going to, I think your issue is she is essentially going to be silent about what takes place in India and is going to give a blank pass for the BJP to do what they do.
Not just silent, but encouraging. She empowers radical religious nationalists in India presently. And I am quite certain that if and when she becomes president, that would escalate dramatically.
How does she empowers them? Like, what's the, I know what the word means, but how is she doing it? Has she said anything? Has she spoken to this? Like, has she, like I give you an example. When Donald Trump comes out after Donald Trump gives you this kind of perspective of who he is based on the things that he says. If he says that most Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, that gives you this idea of what Donald Trump thinks about what, the immigrants. Tulsi, I've never heard her say anything like that. So how does she empower these radical elements? Is it just she empowers them just by virtue of her existence, just by virtue of who she's being paid by?
She empowers them on one level by virtue of having worked actively to suppress any attempt to address these issues in the U.S.
I see. All right, let's see. Who else? All right, I think
which actually puts her at direct odds. It puts her at direct odds with Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the U.S. State Department. It puts her at direct odds with every major international human rights organization in the world.
I understand. And Peter, don't get me wrong. As an absolute, I agree with you. Modi is a bad guy, so don't misunderstand me. And I consider this somewhat of a blotch on the record, which is kind of why I brought you on, because I wanted people to hear, if you support someone warts and all. That's kind of the way I look at it. And so if I ended up saying, yes, I want, I'm supporting Tulsi, I'm supporting her, knowing that she has this association and this affiliation. My issue here is it has to do with U.S. politics. I mean, we're not saints. Like, our country has invaded a country, killed 1 million people in that country, created a war that created an immigrant crisis all throughout Europe. There's been no trials. There's been no consequence. There's been nothing. George Bush is out here finger painting right now.
George W. Bush is a war criminal.
George Bush is a war criminal. Donald Trump or Obama goes in. just manages the thing that Bush created with drone and jumping from country to country to country with a fig leaf of legality associated with it. And Donald Trump comes in doing the same thing, essentially supporting, black operations in these countries where they're doing killings and all. Our country is not full of dandelions. Like, many of these guys are brutal killers in and of themselves in their own rights. And the associations that these guys have, whether it's with Israel or AIPAC, whether it's with Saudi Arabia, have a large impact in political affairs of the United States, like an overt impact in how we go about our affairs. And even in those countries, like, not necessarily in Israel, well, in Israel also, because it allows the Israeli government to do what they do. In Saudi Arabia, same thing. We essentially allow the Saudi Arabia government to do what they do, to dominate their population. So I'm jaded by this. And I think a lot of lefties on this are somewhat jaded because it seems like you're hitting her for something that other people are not being hit with. Is that wrong? Is my assessment of that completely off base?
Well, I would say, are we really going to lower our standards to that bottom level that everybody's bad, so we should not call out anybody for being bad?
No.
The US government has committed atrocities, and so we shouldn't call out any other government for committing atrocities.
No, don't misunderstand me. I brought you on knowing the perspective. You know what I mean? Like, I knew that your perspective of this was critical. And so it's not calling them out. I mean, I let you give I let you give the reasoning of the perspective without interruption because I wanted people to hear it. It's not, I would say this is to some degree calling out. But in the process of calling out, there is also this thing of, well, are we being fair in the process of calling it out? I don't want to lower my standards at all. My candidate in this race is Sanders. That's the person who I want to win. But I'm curious about Tulsi. So I'm Tulsi curious, if that's what people want to hear. And like I said, warts and all, multiple things can be simultaneously true. And so it's not that I don't want to call it out. We are calling it out, but it's like I'm stuck in this country where all of these guys are killers to some degree, and all of these guys are being pushed by other organizations as opposed to the population itself in regards to what he wants and what he wants for foreign policy. And there's moving the ball in a particular direction, and who do I believe can move the ball in that way? And your case is, well, look, Tulsi is bad news because of events that took place in India, and because of her associations and the people who were putting money in her pocket. And the reasonable question is, but what does that look like materially in our context? Meaning, what does it look like in the United States, and what does it look like, or what does it translate to in India? That's what I'm trying to get to. And in your case, you're saying, look, in the standpoint of India, it translates into essentially allowing crimes to take place that aren't being called out. Meaning, things can take place in India where the president of the United States turns a blind eye to because the president of the United States is in bed with the ruling party in India. Whereas in the United States, it allows a certain amount of agency, but the question becomes, what is that really that agency means for the people of the country itself? I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Is that fair? I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying, but I want to kind of put it
as far as India and as far as the US. As far as India, that's basically fair, and that what she's done so far empowers India's religious nationalists to continue and escalate their persecution and their suppression of minorities and of anybody that dissents, really, which includes a great many Hindus. And that if Gabbard was in office, that would dramatically increase, not just continue, but dramatically increase. As far as the impact on the U.S., you tell me.
I don't know. I don't necessarily know what India is trying to accomplish. Like,
I would hope that progressives would be concerned enough about the violence by hegemonic groups against minorities, including in Israel, including waged by the American Empire, including waged by Modi, that these issues would sink into their minds. And I don't have all the answers. I have the future. And all I can say is that in context of this information and in context of the reality, that Tulsi Gabbard's congressional career exists because of financing from internationalists.
By the way, one last question, and I know I lied about the one last question thing. We ended up in a different way. Did Modi go after? Modi didn't just give a blank pass, did he? I mean, he did go after the people who he held responsible. I mean, Brett, you can make the argument he was the one that was responsible for it, but it wasn't. Modi hasn't necessarily just turned a blind eye to religious violence in the country. Where has he? I know that there's been an uptick in the violence. He's been in office.
So I would say that the lip service is one thing, but it's very easy to give lip service while not actually doing anything when members of your own political party and the paramilitary group in which you originated are committing violence against people and lynching people in the streets. Lip service is meaningless.
Okay, fair enough. I see what you're saying. You're saying, him saying I'm going to do X, Y, Z about it is not the same thing as actually doing X, Y, Z about it.
And he's said very little about doing X, Y, Z. He's occasionally made comments where he says, "Oh, that's not okay. That's not cool." But as far as actually any action, there's been zero.
Somebody asks in the race, who are you supporting in the presidency? That could be Trump or anybody else. They're just curious. Also, Pat Hacker wants to know, he says, why are you an expert on India? I guess anybody can be expert on anything. I mean, it just depends on what you devote your time and attention to study. So I'm going to ask the other question.
Let me take those one at a time. I'm an expert on India because I have 12 years of working very, very closely with Indian minority groups, the diaspora, speaking alongside them, even living with them. And I am supporting in the race for president. I have no iron in the fire. I didn't support
iron in the fire.
I didn't support anybody last time. What I support an end to the American empire. I support the withdrawal of all of the American troops from everywhere in the world and back behind American borders. And I support a complete overhaul of U.S. foreign policy.
Yes.
And then I support liberty in the United States of America and a embrace of the principles of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the United States to do nothing more in the world than to live the relevance and the value of those freedoms and liberties out by example within its own borders, and to recommend them to the rest of the world. And then as far as the rest of the world, to talk about what's going on. If there's a Holocaust, we talk about it. If there's a genocide or a pogrom, we talk about it. We don't invade, we don't meddle, we don't play the police of the world, but we definitely expose.
So you're looking for a revolution. But beyond that point, I agree with you on all that. I support all those things also. I support all those things also. I guess it's okay. So you're not supporting any political party. Did you vote for anybody last time? I'm just curious. Again, you didn't necessarily. And votes in this country, are secret. I'm just curious. I look at this and I think, who moves the ball forward in a significant way? And there's certain people who do that. But I agree with you on this point. This kind of baseline of honesty in dealing with politics. If this guy is, this person had association with a bad guy, own up to the fact that the person had association with a bad guy. Don't pretend that it didn't exist. Own it. And make your decision based on the fact that those things exist, as opposed to just pretending as if it's not that big of a deal because it's your candidate. So I agree with you on that. I agree. All right. I'm going to end this. I like that answer. I really like that answer. And I agree with that answer, man. All right, guys, I'm going to end it here. Thank you, Pieter Friedrich, for coming on, author. I'm putting your books below so people can see them for themselves and they can read them. And they can.
And for the record, yes, as many people on Twitter have called out, I am the author of a book called Gandhi, Racist or Revolutionary. And I fully will continue to advance the reality, the indisputable reality that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was a anti-Black African racist, and that's why his statues are getting yanked down in Africa today.
I saw that
because several people. I say that only as one last thing, because several people on Twitter have called that out. And yes, I have written about that.
I don't necessarily know if that's anything to call out. That's just more of a historical thing. You make your argument, and people either agree or disagree with the argument based on the evidence. Well, it's not just based on evidence. People make choices on feelings, meaning, even if the evidence is substantial, they may still like, yeah, I don't feel this. It's like Pluto being a planet. The moment that scientists change it, the planet is just a designation by itself. That designation could change. You're like, no, we're going to continue to believe Pluto's a planet. It's just, and I saw that book. The perspective of Gandhi in our country is different than that. It's very different than that. Gandhi looked at it as a peacenik. The catch is, a person could have been a peacenik. A person could have done extraordinary things in being a peacenik and fighting for some kind of social justice, while simultaneously being, racist or anything else. It's not that people are all pure. We're not talking about some kind of comic book. People can do multiple things. I don't know enough about it to even have an opinion on it, but I did see that book. I did see that book. And you said people are calling it on Twitter. What is there to call out? It just is what it is, right? All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I need to learn more about the Gandhi thing. I've heard, I'm not shocked by what you said, because I've heard that. I've heard people make that argument, saying that Gandhi has said some pretty vicious things. It's taken some pretty.
We do not want to make this about Gandhi. No. Gandhi said a lot of mean things, but he didn't just say mean things. He actively campaigned and successfully campaigned for racial segregation in South Africa about 30, 40 years before apartheid.
Yeah, that's hardcore. But look, people can be multiple things, man. It's not all of one thing. Especially,
nobody's perfect.
Well, I tend to think people function on incentives and the things that apply to you, meaning if something is actively applying to you, you may take a position because something is actively applying to you. It's like, this oppression, I hate this oppression, I'm going to fight back against this oppression. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm perfect in these other areas. I can have some really hateful things,
I agree with that. People are motivated and tend to operate based on incentives. And as we attempt to be good human beings, hopefully we can actually recognize that within ourselves and rise above it.
Agreed. I'll leave it on that. Pieter Friedrich, thank you very much for coming on to the show. I hope this wasn't too bad. I don't want to badger. But as somebody who doesn't necessarily, I like Tulsi, and me liking her gives me a certain bias in regards to her. But I recognize the bias. I know the bias is there, and that bias has to come against certain realities of associations, and you function from there. I try to function from a place of honesty. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. I know this was short notice, so you're always welcome to come back.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good one, guys. All right, guys, I'm going to end it here. If you enjoyed the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You guys can always support through PayPal or Patreon. And hopefully I've done this subject due diligence and justice. Thanks all. Peter.